Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the third chapter of the first book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The text follows. We think we have now passed in review those manifestations of the powers of mind and soul which military activity requires from human nature. Everywhere intellect appears as an essential cooperative force, and thus we can understand how the work of war, although so plain and simple in its effects, can never be conducted with distinguished success by people without distinguished powers of the understanding. When we have reached this view, then we need no longer look upon such a natural idea as the turning an enemy's position, which has been done 1,000 times in 100 other similar conceptions, as the result of a great effort of genius. Certainly, one is accustomed to regard the plain honest soldier as the very opposite of the man of reflection, full of inventions and ideas, or of the brilliant spirit shining in the ornaments of refined education of every kind. This antithesis is also by no means devoid of truth, but it does not show that the efficiency of the soldier consists only in his courage, and that there is no particular energy and capability of the brain required in addition to make a man merely what is called a true soldier. We must again repeat that there is nothing more common than to hear of men losing their energy on being raised to a higher position, to which they do not feel themselves equal. But we must also remind our readers that we are speaking of preeminent services, which as give renown in the branch of activity to which they belong. Each grade of command in war therefore forms its own stratum of requisite capacity, of fame and honor. An immense space lies between a general, that is, one at the head of the wall of a war, or of a theatre of war, and his second in command, for the simple reason that the latter is in more immediate subordination to a superior authority and supervision, consequently is restricted to a more limited sphere of independent thought. This is why common opinion sees no room for the exercise of high talent except in high places, and looks upon an ordinary capacity as sufficient for all beneath. This is why people are rather inclined to look upon a subordinate general grown grey in the service, and in whom a constant discharge of routine duties has produced a decided poverty of mind, as a man of failing intellect, and, with all respect for his bravery, to laugh at his simplicity. It is not our object to gain for these brave men a better lot that would contribute nothing to their efficiency and little to their happiness. We only wish to represent things as they are, and to expose the error of believing that a mere bravo without intellect can make himself distinguished in war. As we consider distinguished talents requisite for those who are to attain distinction, even in inferior positions, it naturally follows that we think highly of those who fill with renown the place of second in command of an army, and their seeming simplicity of character, as compared with a polyhistor, with ready men of business, or with councillors of state, must not lead us astray as to the superior nature of their intellectual activity. It happens sometimes that men import the fame gained in an inferior position into a higher one, without in reality deserving it in the new position. And then, if they are not much employed, and therefore not much exposed to the risk of showing their weak points, the judgment does not distinguish very exactly what degree of fame is really due to them. And thus such men are often the occasion of too low an estimate being formed of the characteristics required to shine in certain situations. For each station, from the lowest upwards, to render distinguished services in war, there must be a particular genius. But the little of genius, history, and the judgment of posterity only confer, in general, on those minds which have shone in the highest rank, that of commanders-in-chief. The reason is that here, in point of fact, the demand on the reasoning and intellectual powers generally is much greater. To conduct a world war or its great acts, which we call campaigns, to a successful termination, there must be an intimate knowledge of state policy in its higher relations. The conduct of the war and the policy of the state here coincide, and the general becomes at the same time the statesman. We do not give Charles XII the name of a great genius, because he could not make the power of his sword subservient to a higher judgment, and philosophy could not attain by it to a glorious object. We do not give that little to Henry IV of France, because he did not live long enough to set at rest the relations of different states by his military activity, and to occupy himself in that higher field where noble feelings and a chivalrous disposition had less to do in mastering the enemy than in overcoming internal dissension. In order that the reader may appreciate all that must be comprehended and judged of correctly at a glance by a general, we refer to the first chapter. We say the general becomes a statesman, but he must not cease to be a general. He takes into view all the relations of the state on the one hand. On the other, he must know exactly what he can do with the means at his disposal. As the diversity and undefined limits of all these circumstances bring a great number of factors into consideration in war, as the most of these factors can only be estimated according to probability, therefore, if the chief of an army does not bring to bear upon them a mind with an intuitive perception of the truth, a confusion of ideas and views must take place, in the midst of which the judgment will become bewildered. In this sense, Bonaparte was right when he said that many of the questions which come before a general for decision would make problems for a mathematical calculation not unworthy of the powers of Newton and Euler. What is here required from the higher powers of the mind is a sense of unity, and a judgment raised to such a compass as to give the mind an extraordinary faculty of vision, which in its strange allays and sets aside 1,000 dim notions which an ordinary understanding could only bring to light with great effort, and over which it would exhaust itself. But this higher activity of the mind, this glance of genius, would still not become matter of history in the qualities of temperament and character of which we have treated did not give it their support. Truth alone is but a weak motive of action with men, and hence there is always a great difference between knowing and action, between science and art. The man receives the strongest impulse to action through the feelings, and the most of powers occur, if we may use the expression, through those faculties of heart and mind which we have considered under the terms of resolution, firmness, perseverance, and force of character. If, however, this elevated condition of heart and mind in the general did not manifest itself in the general effects resulting from it, and could only be accepted on trust and faith, then it would rarely become matter of history. All that becomes known of the course of events in war is usually very simple, and has a great sameness in appearance. No one on the mere relation of such events perceives the difficulties connected with them which had not to be overcome. It is only now and again in the memoirs of generals, or of those in their confidence, or by reason of some special historical inquiry directed to a particular circumstance, that a portion of the many threads composing the whole web is brought to light. The reflections, mental doubts, and conflicts which precede the execution of great acts are purposely concealed because they affect political interests, or the recollection of them is accidentally lost because they have been looked upon as mere scaffolding which had to be removed on the completion of the building. If now, in conclusion, without venturing upon a closer definition of the higher powers of the soul, we should admit a distinction in the intelligent faculties themselves, according to the common ideas established by language, and ask ourselves what kind of mind comes closest to military genius, then a look at the subject as well as the experience will tell us that searching rather than inventive in minds, comprehensive minds rather than such as have a special bent, cool rather than fiery heads, are those to which in time of war we should prefer to trust the welfare of our women and children, the honor and the safety of our fatherland. So, intense passage that concludes the third chapter, that in fact draws certain final considerations about these powers of mind and soul which military activity requires from human nature, right? Or better, the manifestations, also because the mind is naturally mysterious and difficult to scope, right? And von Clausewitz says, okay, we have passed them in review. And then he writes, everywhere intellect appears as an essential cooperative force. And thus we can understand how the work of war, although so plain and simple in its effects, can never be conducted with distinguished success by people without distinguished powers of the understanding. This is particularly important. In war, intelligence is superior to feelings, right? It can't be without feelings, just like feelings cannot be without intelligence, but the understanding, the intelligence, definitely are the ones who have the largest importance, and by far. And we could digress immensely about this, but if you have followed the series now, I think you have understood it, and you can still go look from the beginning. Because as you know, basically von Clausewitz refuses a scientific positivistic approach to understanding war, but it still says, it doesn't say, okay, so we don't need intelligence. Of course, our intelligence can discover most of the, can get most, to some solutions, right? And it's actually what you need, rationally speaking, in order to solve problems, right? And that's how important then can be. But there are also, in the general degree of danger and probability and odds, let's say, that are always kind of foolish in many ways to approach, because you can never have the certainty, right? It's a great gamble, right? But sometimes you have to do it. So you basically have to be able to calculate it, but you can never be sure you can win. And therefore, in order to take this, you need guts, right? It's like playing the Russian roulette, right? You maths does serve in that sense, and you probably hopefully got there with your own consent. In that case, we're just thinking about the deer hunter, which incidentally wasn't like that, but it's still, you need the guts to pull the trigger at that point. Well, that's exactly how it is. I like that. I never used this metaphor. Yes, and here von Clausewitz also touches obviously the idea of the composite cooperation, let's say, of the cooperation in general between mind and feelings, right? Between mind and soul, how he calls it. And he points out that, however, intelligence is so important that you can't really see, right? Any great result in war, right? So here by great result we mean something that happens also at the higher levels of the hierarchy, so that eventually affects the greatest part of war without having had a mind behind that, right? Without having had an understanding and intelligence. And this is particularly important because now I wouldn't like to digress too much, because this passage is definitely pretty long already by itself, but it's all about the concept of unity of command, of hierarchies, of organic, that we have analyzed previously, and on which von Clausewitz will come back on during the work. But it's obvious that there is this kind of growth from the simple to, let's say, to the complex, right? That needs the understanding of the complex. I mean, even when things get simpler, because let's say the hierarchy gets to the top, and generally speaking, there are the choices should be as quick as possible. It's really who's on the field that has to take care of the most dangerous things, at least. However, what is at the top in terms of decision making is definitely the most difficult thing of all, and it cannot be the problem cannot be solved by who doesn't really have an intelligence and an understanding. But this goes far beyond, and maybe we haven't stressed enough how this is the case, really, and how difficult it is really to make a sensible military decision. As we will see now in this passage, basically that comes to at one point to overlap even with politics, right? But and that's enormously complicated. But it's important because it's usually counterintuitive. At least in today's world, we think that everything is so simple, so that every average no one can know everything about everything, right? And this is not true. This is not possible. And that's why we need this hierarchy and this way of organizing things, because presumably and hopefully who gets at the top is the most competent person, right? So the person who has achieved that, has reached that position, let's say, because of the ability that that position requires. And it's not often the case, telling the truth, and sadly enough. But we will see now how von Clausewitz develops the concept. In fact, he writes, when we have reached this view, then we need no longer look upon such a natural idea as determining an enemy's position, which has been done 1,000 times in 100 other similar conceptions, as the result of a great effort of genius, right? So there are certain things that happen in war that fundamentally are, can't say really mechanical. They all fundamentally descend from some kind of greater organization, but let's say that it's not everything. And we also have a problem in order to understand how much merit and ability was there. But let's say that military genius is something fundamentally rare that that inhabits, tends to inhabit, let's say, the higher ranks, or at least that is put at serviceably in use, profitably in use, in those positions, so that you can have a new Napoleon, let's assume, but that is just a soldier for whichever reason cannot reach so easily to the top. So those are all the undiscovered talents that can be found. But let's say what von Clausewitz is saying here is that behind, in fact, taking an enemy position, one point, there's not necessarily this huge effort of genius, right? But it's really at the top where all these actions basically get supervised that the great effort of genius is required. Then von Clausewitz writes, certainly one is accustomed to regard the plain honest soldier as the very opposite of the man of reflection, full of inventions and ideas, or of the brilliant spirit shining in the ornaments of refined education of every kind, right? So this is self-explanatory that there is this tendential prejudice to conceive the average trooper as fundamentally not really a man endowed with particularly with a particularly great developed intellect, let's put it in this way, nor an excessively educated person, nor someone who writes who shines for his own inventions and understanding. And then von Clausewitz goes on saying, this antithesis is also by no means devoid of truth, but it does not show that the efficiency of the soldier consists only in his courage, and that there is no particular energy and capacity of the brain required in addition to make a man merely what is called a true soldier, right? So here von Clausewitz is saying, it is true, there is a hierarchy, but the more we get closer to the top, the closer we get to the top, let's say, and the more greater intellects should be found. But still, even to be a soldier, you can't just be courageous, right? You can't just be someone who threw himself against a machine gun nest without thinking what he's doing. I mean, by certain standards, there is a certain disciplinary and logic that also doesn't require the discussion of certain orders, etc. And that's what martial law is really about. But at the same time, even the soldier naturally has to be, first of all, very quick of mind rather than simply courageous. Of course, if he cannot, launch himself in the assault, well, he's probably not going to be of tremendous use, but still, the mind is more powerful, right? And von Clausewitz, in fact, writes, by the way, excuse me, before we go on, there is always this presence of intelligence at every rank, right, of the hierarchy. So, von Clausewitz then says, we must again repeat, the brain required in addition to make a man, no, I already read it, we must again repeat, and there is nothing more common than to hear of men losing their energy on being raised to a higher position to which they do not feel themselves equal. Because it is true, on the one hand, Clausewitz says that there are certain men who are particularly, let's say, courageous, valiant, and that, however, when they reach a higher rank, basically, that they are promoted, they don't shine equally on that field, because basically their abilities are naturally designed for that particular rank. I mean, it can also go otherwise. It often happens, though, right? And a theory is that the higher you go, and the more selection there's gonna be on average from this point of view. So that reaching to the top entails a lot of pressure, a lot of responsibility, right? Being in front of a machine gun is something that takes a lot of guts. But having on yourself, on your shoulders, the responsibility of the life of thousands of people from your decision is not equally. It's not less, definitely not less dreadful in this sense. So, and especially when you can't invent intelligence, right? Every human can find kind of courage in his own heart, or at least that's much easier than to find intelligence, because intelligence is a construct. It's something you have to work on it. If you have never gotten to one point with your mind, it's not that magically you can find a solution, right? Many people believe so, because incidentally are those people who really can't go far beyond, so they don't practically even know that things are way more complicated than they actually are, and you can see it basically and literally everywhere you look at in society. That the main problem with ignorance, at the end of the day, is not even the fact of not knowing, but acting, pretending that it's all there, right? Which is it entails a bit more of malice, but it often happens, unfortunately. So that even that comes also with a bit of knowledge, telling the truth, so that it's even difficult to find someone who is, purely ignorant, so that is kind of candid and as an innocent soul, let's say. However, von Clausewitz says, but we must also remind our readers that we are speaking of preeminent services of such as give renown in the branch of activity to which they belong. So, we also have to understand this, meaning that it's obvious that the higher up you get into the hierarchy, and the more different the tasks and the more difficult at the same time the tasks required are in that situation. So, von Clausewitz says, each grade of command in war therefore forms its own stratum of requisite capacity of fame and honor. That is to say, every grade of command owns this different set of, let's say, requires this set of intelligence and emotional capacities that others do not have. And that's why, there's also such a great confusion in military history, for example, in judging the greatness, the actual ability of a commander, because these rankings are often made by people who don't really even understand the fact that, you know, being a great commander is in itself doesn't quite mean anything if you don't specify at which level of command you're really talking about, because there are, you know, great, excellent company commanders were completely inept division commanders, and it happens literally all over history. That's why, for example, we have a myth of Rommel as one of the greatest generals of World War II. Well, he actually wasn't under this point of view, but not because, you know, he wasn't, you know, he was an idiot. It's simply because, you know, he was, for that specific task that he did particularly well, then when he was entrusted with different roles, you know, he didn't simply meet that requirements. And that's important, because it's also very fair. It's how really society should work at the end of the day. You know, if you're not capable of doing something, or you don't, you know, you can't see from the results that it doesn't, you know, it does not succeed. For example, I don't think I'm pretty good at explaining von Clausewitz, and this may be reflected by, you know, the fruits that these videos bear. But in general, you know, you have to be fair, not just with history or, you know, reality, but the way you are at the end of the day, because you are also framed within these hierarchies, and you have to accept fundamentally your limits, and observe that maybe you are really, that this is not bad, that you have a space, there is something you can do particularly well, and you should invest in that, because that's gonna make you successful. It's gonna make society better, and things are gonna really work. And this is what hierarchies should be about. Today we seemingly are rejecting and forgetting all these notions that are demonstrated by, you know, basically every single scientific study that is done about society, you know, human mind and sociology, whatever, you know, and history, that we have to buy the notion that we are all equal. There is not a single person in the world that is equal to another, and thank God for that, right? So, but this is important now for what concerns us about judging the ability of a commander, right? Then von Clausewitz goes on and says, an immense space lies between a general that is one at the head of a world war, or of a theater of war, and his second in command, for the simple reason that the latter is in more immediate subordination to a superior authority and supervision, consequently is restricted to a more limited sphere of independent thought. So it's basically what we were hinting at before, is that there's a lot of hidden talent that is eventually there, every once in a while, you know, maybe not even so rarely as we may think. But when we judge, you know, history in general, and by history I mean in this sense literally everything that has ever happened in human existence that we can document, we have to look at it thinking, you know, what the specific roles of individuals are, right? Because this is something really make a lot of confusion about when we see a very successful politician or general or whatever, that we tend to think, in the absence of other, you know, evidence, that maybe he did all that thing by himself, and there is a part of truth and a part of non-truth. I mean, the truth is that, of course, if there is a hierarchy and there is one person that is in charge of that situation, definitely most of the responsibility plausibly derives from that person. So you can't really exclude it. It's like the outcome of you know, of these events. Like, you know, it's difficult to tell how, for example, a battle is won or lost, but even if there is a general that is employed in 10 battles and he loses all of 10 of them, unless there is not a massively, you know, a particular reason for which, you know, maybe there was no chance at that point, well, to win in any case, but most of the times really it's not like this, and also for quite logical reasons. Well, you may legitimately presume that the outcome at that point does make a difference and does effectively show, albeit not directly but quite, sufficiently acceptably, that that commander was not that good, right? And on the other hand, you see that the subordinates that sometimes are really key figures, right? There are some of the greatest politicians or generals or monarchs, etc., that really owe a lot to their second in command, right? And sometimes the second in command is able to take the matter in his own hand. However, still his ability is limited, and we have to understand this. We don't. I mean, that position is created exactly in order to have a limited sphere, a more limited sphere of independent thought, as von Clausewitz puts it. So, what this means is that sometimes even a great talent may be fundamentally driven astray from other situation, from other factors, right? But let's go on to be a bit more precise. Von Clausewitz writes, "This is why common opinion sees no room for the exercise of high talent except in high places, and looks upon an ordinary capacity as sufficient for all beneath." This is why people are rather inclined to look upon a subordinate general grown grey in the service, and in whom constant discharge of routine duties has produced a decided poverty of mind, as a man of failing intellect, and, with all respect for his bravery, to laugh at his simplicity. So there is a way to kind of dismiss certain individuals that, simply because they're limited in this exercise, autonomous, independent, let's say, exercise of intellect, have developed a this kind of dependence from this limitation. So they haven't developed this autonomous intelligence at 360 degrees, right? And therefore we tend to laugh at them, von Clausewitz says, but we don't really have to be tricked at this point. In fact, he writes, "It is not our object to gain for this brave men a better lot that would contribute nothing to their efficiency and little to their happiness. We only wish to represent things as they are, and to expose the error of believing that a mere bravo without intellect can make himself distinguished in war." Right? So Clausewitz here is basically saying, that there are people who fundamentally are they're limited intellectually speaking, but in an organic form, in a hierarchical perspective, let's say, these people are necessary. You can't really do without them. It's like, there are sometimes even pretty nasty remarks on these things, like, Frederick II, Frederick the Great, was credited with a phrase with, I don't know if he actually pronounced it, but something like, if my soldiers started to think, I would not have an army. Like, it's pretty bitter, right? But it perfectly exemplifies, especially in that context of paradigmatic exemplar Prussian discipline that was called pretty devoid of every mercy, basically. The concept that if the political and military structure has been formed in that way, objectively you have to fit in a way that you can't really go astray from that. So here von Clausewitz says we don't really want to offend these people, right? It's not a matter of saying these are like kids or said. It simply takes to understand that a higher mind is something rarer. It's required for certain specific tasks, and that the others can do, however, an excellent job on their own, without which, at the end of the day, even the higher mind wouldn't be able to operate in this context, right? And he says, you know, this man, he actually makes a great, a great compliment to them by saying that, you know, that we don't need to this kind of think about NCOs, etc. You know, we don't need to flatter them, because that would contribute nothing to their efficiency and little to their happiness, because they're content to do essentially what they know how to do best. The important is that they are efficient. The important is that, you know, they don't care probably what that other people think that they are in a subordinate rank. And then this is kind of important if you consider the historical context, because this was a moment of transformation from the ancient, you know, class armies, like, you know, the idea that only the noblemen could be officers, etc. And the idea now of integrating people with, you know, in creating a hierarchy based on merit and competence, even aside from social extraction in part. So this is important because von Clausewitz is definitely recognizing, as he had evidently to rely for great part of his life on them, of this midmen fundamentally in the army that are necessary as much as the great commander, that however is still the one who has the greater the greater duty, the greater task, the greater responsibility, right? So you can't really take just a person who is particularly courageous and pretending that suffices in war to take very hard decisions. You need, first of all, an intelligent person, and then hopefully with certain characteristics that we have explained, but that are theoretically second, but also practically at the end of the day in war. Von Clausewitz writes, as we consider distinguished talents requisite for those who are to attain distinction, even in inferior positions, it naturally follows that we think highly of those who fill with renown the place of second in command of an army. And their seeming simplicity of character, as compared with a polistor, with a ready man of business, or with councillors of state, must not lead us astray as to the superior nature of the intellectual activity. In other words, you have to understand what they're really about. Pure intellectualism, like intellectualism in the first place, I would say, is it doesn't work in war. You can't take some of the most refined intellects, as we've seen in previous videos, and putting them in condition in which they have to fight, and maybe they can even understand what's the right thing to do with their mind, but they're not necessarily going to follow it. So it doesn't make sense to compare these individuals to something that they're not really required to be, and their practical skill is way more important than sectorial way of considering them. That is, they have to be intelligent as well, in this case second in command, but at the same time they also have to have those particular and practical capabilities that usually, even, you know, very intelligent people usually do not have. Excuse me, I drink a little before we go on. So von Clausewitz goes on then. Again, he says, it happens sometimes that the man imports the fame gained in an inferior position into a higher one, without in reality deserving it in the new position. Kind of a typical situation, right? You know, that's about meritocracy, as we were discussing it before. It happens many times that people are promoted into ranks into grades that they do not really deserve more than and von Clausewitz says, and then if they are not much employed and therefore not much exposed to the risk of showing their weak points, the judgment does not distinguish very exactly what degree of fame is really due to them. And this is very important, because it means, you know, until you don't test someone, and here in war, it really makes the difference, for example, being in the military in a period of peace and one of war, right? There are kind of different things. Obviously, the same fact of being a military man has hopefully means that you pass through, a pretty harsh selection to get where you are. Yet, that's not really completely enough. At least there are in every kind of military in the world this, interfering factors for which, think about the recommendations or political direction, corruption, and all this stuff that objectively, also from an historical point of view, made the difference at one point. Because if you have a corrupt regime in which all the great generals are just friends of the great leader, let's suppose, and they've been placed there not because of their their military qualities, but simply because of clientelism. Well, that's the recipe for a disaster, and actually there's plenty of historical examples of that kind. And then Clausewitz writes, and thus such men are often the occasion of too low an estimate being formed of the characteristics required to shine in certain situations. This is also very important, in my opinion, from a strictly military historical point of view, because coming back on that consideration we were doing before about recognizing the true quality of a great historical figure, well, it happens clamorously often that we push for this deterministic ideas for which, if that guy won the battle, it was because he was the best. Really, no. And there is this tendency to try to make sense of certain things that at the end of the day we do not know, and that we try to push, historically speaking, basically following the agenda of the sources that we are reading. To make an example, maybe, but that's maybe too controversial, because I'm sure that people have, but let's try to address it. Think about Caesar and Pompey, right? There is no doubt that Caesar was one of the greatest commanders of his times, and he was a pretty damn intelligent man, and from all what we know, he really made the best choices, or at least he went through situations he was able to get out of which he was able to get out in a way that eventually his adversaries weren't, right? But the point is exactly what is that we know. Take a battle like Pharsalus and says, okay, well, Caesar wins and Pompey is defeated, and eventually he, after some time, he even gets killed, so his story ends. So history has naturally depicted that that story on the base of what we know, that is dramatically limited. Now, I'm not saying that here I'm not making a consideration on the figures of Caesar and Pompey, because it's obvious that as a whole, because it's obvious that if you even consider Caesar's starting point and Pompey's starting point, you realize that Pompey was dramatically more advantaged under many points of view, so Caesar is more praisable. He has this, but concentrating on the single turning point, like the Battle of Pharsalus, for example, what is that we know? Really, it's like one dead source or two. And do you think that after 2,000 years we can actually know what happened on the Battle of Pharsalus? Do you really know? We know, for example, what happened actually, for real, on the battlefield of Hastings, for example. Because if you believe that we know, well, that's where the problem starts, because we actually do not know. And it's not, and it's dramatic how sometimes this form of reasoning is, let's say, kidnapped, with its misused by people who have an agenda that maybe want to say, well, we don't know, so we can make relativism and push him from one side rather than the other. But it's way beyond that, for which, this BS shouldn't even touch our mind. The problem is that for real we do not know, but we build a picture, however, that reflects a narrative, right? That it's not necessarily, a product of propaganda or something, but it's how, for all, historiographical, cultural, political reason, we arrive to that idea of the past. And this happens at the end of the day, as we see with history, that really is literally everything. History is not what you find in dusty books that tell the stories. History is literally every single thing that is happening right now at every moment. So if you want to make any consideration about anything that happens in reality, you are a historian by some degree. If not fully. So the point in here is that most of the times, and this is what von Clausewitz will teach us also for many other ways, but with the fog of war and not only, that most of the times we don't really know. And at a certain point we have to stop and simply say, okay, can we actually prove a relation cause-effect between these two events, or we have to give up. And believe me, this is not a rhetorical question. I mean, it's or better, it kind of is, in the sense that what does it mean to know in the first place? So it's particularly complicated now. I don't want to descend in further questions, but you understand that our judgment is very foggy, and the only way we have probably to get closer to the truth is to check when things are really under the light, under the sunlight. And now von Clausewitz will explain it for us, telling the truth. So now he says something else, but we will be reconnected with this. He says, for each station, from the lowest upwards, to render distinguished services in war, there must be a particular genius. But the title of genius, history, and the judgment of posterity only confer, in general, on those minds which have shown in the highest rank that of commanders-in-chief. Actually, we touch on the topic here, because von Clausewitz says, there is always a certain amount of genius everywhere, but the point is that most of the times we know only the one of commanders-in-chief. Just like at the Battle of Pharsalus, what do we know that, I don't know, maybe Pompey lost? I mean, say, Caesar won because there was a particular subordinate that did something particularly courageous that we do not know because sources did not record, and that's how the victory was achieved, right? So von Clausewitz is simply stating this. Is saying, be on guard and be always aware that this might be an option, right? So he says, then, the reason is that here, in point of fact, the demand on the reasoning and intellectual powers generally is much greater. So, it is true that, to flip it once again, to reverse it once again in perspective, that there are elements that can make that difference. Hell, even a broken wheel of a carriage can make the difference. At one point, von Clausewitz will say exactly this. It's a factor of attrition at the end of the day. But it is still true. It is still true that commanders-in-chief are usually the ones with higher reasoning and intellectual powers, that incidentally are also the ones that are mostly exposed also to, let's say, to history, because that's what history is looked at, the guy that was at the top, because most of history, believe it or not, was actually carried out by competent hierarchies, right? The hierarchies for existing in the first place have to work, so that even if you put an inept in there, even the reasons why he was put in there are kind of partly logical, so that it's not really the newest person found, by chance somewhere else. It's still someone that was expected at least to have that particular ability, or to make up for its lack in some ways. But still the point is that the commander-in-chief is the person who has effectively more power, hence more responsibility, and is also more exposed. Is the one that, for this very reason, is also demanded results right? And is asked directly for it, it has to respond for its work, right? Then von Clausewitz says, to conduct a world war or its great acts, which we call campaigns, to a successful termination, there must be an intimate knowledge of state policy in its higher relations. The conduct of the war and the policy of the state here coincide, and the general becomes at the same time the statesman. Now, this is particularly important because, aside from the fact that historically speaking, there are certain commanders that are also statesmen. You know, think about emperors or kings. You know, that's kind of an example, good example. But in general, even when you sharply define, in fact, even in the organisms and institutions, the political side and the military side, you realize, as we have observed since the very first chapters, that the higher strategical decisions are tightly linked to the political direction, right? And the commander-in-chief is the person who essentially dialogues with policy, with politicians, with the state, is effectively the person who is entrusted a mandate to carry out. So now it could get subtler, but the concept is, however, that great strategical choices have to take into consideration very closely the fact that those strategical conditions change primarily on the base of political choices. Just to make an example, in order to organize a campaign, you need a state that pays for it and that has some interest to make its war, etc. So the commander-in-chief is entrusted with these means and naturally has to understand how far he can stretch them, also on the base of how politics will basically respond to his conduct. While it's different, for example, in the case of something that is happening from the field at a tactical level, let's assume, during the battle, therefore, that has basically little to do with politics, even though it has still to do with it in so many ways. You can imagine, think about it, just about the social extraction of the soldiery, or the kind of expectations that derive from the political motivation, for example. So that is always present, but there is a way things have to be carried out at the highest level, at a way that expands into a realm that goes beyond the strictly military element, and it has to do with the broader one at all levels. And naturally, military commanders-in-chief also ask policy to give an answer, to provide means, or to and there is this sharp contact that you can find basically in all military history between the commander-in-chief and who decided to be at war and wants war to go on, and is responsible also for starting it or finishing it, right? And this is, remember, this is crucial in Clausewitzian thought, because we have seen it in many videos ago at this point, but that is never to be forgotten is that politics is every single time into war, that there can't be a general, von Clausewitz writes, that can think that he's completely absolute as a military commander, because politics always controls the military instrument. And this is really, I give you, it's difficult to understand, because we try to detach policy and war, like as if political policy was one thing, was the peaceful, nice side of the story, and war just the brutal, animal-like side. And this is a pretty childish understanding of history that definitely, proves pretty, great ignorance, I would say, of this same topics, but also is dangerous in so many other ways, because the only way you can justify that vision of the world is that basically you consider that war is something cultural, which means that just stupid or brute or inferior peoples make war. So you trace that kind of hierarchy, and it's never like that. War is made by, if there is something that history has taught us pretty brutally and violently, is that with the progress of civilization, the destructive capabilities do not lower, they do increase in parallel. So I know this is also another digression, but if you don't accept this, basically you can't understand von Clausewitz, and you can't understand reality at the end of the day. So and I realize it's tough. And that's the same reason why I'm spending so much time making von Clausewitz videos out here, because I hope that someone can make this effort to try to understand it, and I do it very openly because I read and comment von Clausewitz. So I basically give you the evidence in here, and I think I support it when I make videos of other topics, because that's pretty much it. That's we talk about everything. We talk about policy, we talk about war, we talk about society and Schwerpunkt. And the objective, although I don't really explicitate every time we talk about history, but it's really proving Clausewitzian point. And it's not even a matter of proving it, it's really a matter of understanding that it is that things work that way, because basically you could demonstrate this even without passing from von Clausewitz. Obviously you should be a new von Clausewitz that has never heard about him in the first place, but I think we could be you know, humble and clever and honest enough to accept that we have to learn, especially from people that have already lived, and abandoning the delusion that we're somehow better, because turns out we really are not. And in fact dismissing Clausewitzian ideal, saying I don't want to have anything with this to do with this because it sounds controversial, I don't care. Well, this is a proof of actual moral inferiority, in my opinion, because it's a way to say, okay, I don't care that there is something that is really explaining me thoroughly what I simply dismiss it. I don't want to even hear it. Well, this means to, like, saying, you know, you could have the solution to solve quite a big deal of problems, and you say, no, I don't want to know about it because I don't care, making those problems keeping going on, and that has a pretty you know, that's pretty moral, in my opinion. And that's what learning should be about in theory. Then of course there are lots of other things to learn in the world, not just about von Clausewitz, but passing through von Clausewitz is definitely not a bad choice. It's not a, you know, a secondary need. It's not just kind of eccentric interest. It should be really what all of our civic, political, and cultural perspectives should revolve around. At least in my opinion. Then I don't really want to convince anyone. I'm not here for this, but I would like to at least get people interested. That would already be really a big thing. So here von Clausewitz provides some examples, about some historical examples about this concept. He talks about Charles the 12th of Sweden and Henry IV of France. So as you know, some of the most important figures of the modern age. So he says, we do not give Charles XII the name of great genius, because he could not make the power of his sword subservient to a higher judgment and philosophy, could not attain by it to a glorious object. Now you know that basically Charles XII brings to the, you know, under his reign, Sweden had the most advanced military in, if not in the world, definitely in Europe, in Western Europe. In Europe in general. I mean, the other most advanced military, you know, can't look up at that time is China or something like that, but definitely the beginning of 18th century Sweden has this first place in Europe, but he screws up at the end of the day. He's defeated in the Great Northern War. His army is annihilated, and the Swedish army was in that context specifically the Schwerpunkt of Swedish power. That means that once he crumbled, basically it was destroyed at Poltava, and in the ruinous advance and subsequent retreat in the Ukrainian steppes, the Swedish power is downsized, right? And von Clausewitz here says it. He had this powerful sword that, however, that is the Swedish army, the Carolina at that time. That, however, was not used. And always remember here, policy war is just a continuation of policy by other means. Was not used validly by a higher judgment and philosophy. Charles XII made a mistake, and he paid for that, right? So this is a perfect example that von Clausewitz uses to prove, first of all, in general, as a context, that the military instrument is radically and constantly and unescapably a tool of is controlled by policy, right? And that in this case, Charles XII had the best military around, but he misused it, right? He made a wrong decision, and he paid dearly for it. Then von Clausewitz says, we do not give the title to Henry IV of France either, because he did not live long enough to set at rest the relations of different states by his military activity, and to occupy himself in that higher field where noble feelings and chivalrous disposition have less to do in mastering the enemy than in overcoming internal dissension, right? So here he's saying, taking Henry IV, we don't really know how his full military potential really was, because albeit he had put an end basically to the wars of religion in France, so putting together this massive European country that would come to become the hegemonic power in Europe under his grandson, he didn't live enough. He was assassinated, as you know, and therefore we actually do not know what he could have done. That was what von Clausewitz was saying before, right? You can't. The guy might have reached that power of command, but was he actually good? You can't really tell, because he didn't prove it. He didn't have an option to prove it, and this is also very important to think. There are many, for example, romantic figures of commanders that, I don't know, died, for example, young and bold, and there is this idea, the West, we work as Westerners with the model of Alexander the Great, right? If Asia had been conquered by Philip II, we would have had a completely different military ethos. We would have taken instead the figure of the old mature man who thoughtfully considered everything. No, instead we have the model of Alexander. We think about the young man who conquers everything and is so courageous and bold, and up to at the point of excessive risk, but then manages it, that however dies young, right? So we have the sympathy also for other cultural reasons, telling the truth about our origins, to have more sympathy, and it's a bit human worldwide. It's not just Western telling the truth, but in the West has acquired a deeper meaning in many ways, that we have to say, okay, well, that was a kind of a hero, right? And there are, in fact, historically speaking, these figures that maybe died young or did not have the chance to prove something, and that we need to idealize, because hey, that was a heroic. Maybe that person was not even a good commander, was not even particularly talented, but there are also myths that are formed around these people. Definitely it's not the case of Alexander. It's one of the, it's the greatest commander of the ancient world, but the concept is that we don't have to to sympathize just with feelings, right? We have to be reasonable about our choice, because at the end of the day, it's about intellect. It's about reason most of the times, right? Especially when it has to do with historical assessment, right? Von Clausewitz shows us that in order to be a military commander, you have to be, first of all, very intelligent, and then resolute, right? And having also this further ability of connecting the two things and taking the right decision. But when you're a military historian, or a historian in general for that matter, you can't, that you're courageous doesn't really matter much, right? You have to be courageous just maybe to address, an enormous pile of sources. Well, that maybe you need courage, but let's say in the moment of history that is research proper, the only thing is required to you is to be intelligent, which means theoretically, obviously can't be attained, but tendentially, preferably, only reasonable, an only rational actor, let's say. That, as you understand, it's impossible, but we try, right? Okay. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, in order that the reader may appreciate all that must be comprehended and judged of correctly at a glance by a general, we refer to the first chapter. Okay, so go look at it. As you know, if you go into the Von Clausewitz Vom Kriege playlist, you will find this. Then he says, we say the general becomes a statesman, but he must not cease to be the general. This is also very important. The general is always the general. There is no, there can be, as we have seen before, the historical coexistence of political and military power at the same time, but still here they're theoretically distinguished. So when you make the general, you don't have to be a politician, even if you have to understand policy, but still when you're general, you have to behave like a general for what it pertains to military matters, right? So that's still something different, and that's why the qualities of the statesman are, which should be overwhelmingly intelligence, right, are not the same ones required to the general. And also, this is also hierarchy, remember it. In other words, the statesman is more important than the general. And I know that maybe this doesn't sound very popular because, we have our own kind of idols in the sense that think the politicians are all corrupted. Yeah, and generals are the kind of the cool guys that wins battles and all. But in the real hierarchy of our society, well, for Clausewitz points it out, it's policy rules over the military instrument all the time, and it couldn't be otherwise. It couldn't be otherwise by definition, not by political judgment. So these are things at this point that I don't repeat. I don't explain because these are things we have already seen in previous chapters. So this series should be followed, bearing in mind just when you study the Vom Kriege, that you should bear in mind everything has been written before, and definitely it's not easy, but that's what is required. Then Von Clausewitz goes on and says he takes the general into view all the relations of the state on the one hand, on the other he must know exactly what he can do with his means at his disposal. This is the perfect definition of the general's condition. He has to understand what he can, what is going on in policy, because essentially he's dependent on the means that are provided to him by policy, right? So there is a dialogue, definitely, but still the task is different. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, as the diversity and undefined limits of all the circumstances bring to a great number of factors into consideration in war, as the most of these factors can only be estimated according to probability. Therefore, if the chief of an army does not bring to bear upon them a mind with an intuitive perception of the truth, a confusion of ideas and views must take place, in the midst of which the judgment will become bewildered. So a long period, but the concept is very clear. It's a sort of, recapitulation of the idea that the chief of an army has to have these specific qualities that in this completely messy realm, domain of war, allow him to kind of synthesize all the information and to make the machine going on. And he cannot concentrate on different things, because this is an astonishingly difficult task on its own, to which he has to commit all of his psychophysical resources, and that's the role that stays with him. And it's a bit of a repetition, to which for Clausewitz also adds, but nevertheless important, to which he also adds an anecdote about Napoleon, because it says, in this sense, Bonaparte was right when he said that many of the questions which come before a general for decision would make problems for a mathematical calculation not unworthy of the powers of Newton and Euler. So what does this mean here? Von Clausewitz is not talking in absolute terms, of course, but he's making us understand something very important, that is that solving military problems is freaking complicated. And not just, you think, it just take, in fact, many people still rely on the idea that the general has to be just courageous. No, he has to be intelligent. First of all, these are enormously difficult mathematical problems, and I stress this because, for example, when you hear someone that gives simplistic interpretations of history, for example, you can easily understand that most of the people, I would say, and especially I would say those who don't really care about these topics, to be a bit more kind of humble in their thinking, really have the limit of not understanding how really difficult problems are. Like, I think, have you ever tried to solve a tactical problem like the ones that 16 years old cadets in the Prussian military academies of the 19th centuries did? Do you really want to put yourself to the test? Try to look at that, and you would find that I think only a person over 20 would have a natural understanding or natural tendency in order to frame actually what the problem is in the first place. The others would just go around in wonder, lost in the darkness in front of this thing, because they've never simply arrived to that level. And the problems are complicated. It seems now to be denied as a sport in our days. We have both this notion that everybody can understand everything. This is not true. But this is not true because someone is imposing it on someone, right? You can't learn. No. Today every and each one of us can learn. That's the interesting part of the story, is that for millennia we have struggled in order to get an education. Now we have it a click away for free, and nobody gives a freaking damn about it. And we are dumbing down. I mean, the concept of solving problems, that is not reading or seeing or watching a lot of stuff and making a synthesis out of it on the base of your guts, but really spitting blood because of the work of your brain. Well, that's something that we have started to lose. At least I'm not necessarily saying that people are getting dumber in the in absolute terms. I think that we are abandoning the idea of solving concrete and difficult problems especially from a mental point of view, which is strange because actually we have, in 1 century we switched from practical problem solving to theoretical problem solving. But it seems this one is kind of sinking as well, or at least we are developing towards some directions, but we seem not to be disciplined into the process, and that's a clock bomb in many ways. And I don't know where we will get with this at the end. So moral of the story is never underestimate the difficulty of learning, and especially never underestimate the power of an articulate thought. I mean, not just do not consider that it's difficult simply to learn, but also consider the benefits that you can get from learning, which is also very, very important, because with learning you can have that. You can really have a lot, and seemingly nobody's interested in something that is evidently and extremely precious. So in this case, von Clausewitz's remark was addressed chiefly to seeing that resolving military problems is very, very difficult, so that Napoleon was credited with this quote about the need of scientists, fundamentally, like Newton and Euler, in order to solve problems that evidently the average mind is not really, because not even the general is a scientist at the end of the day. And also he has not really to be, if we understood what is needed. I mean, it doesn't exclusively has to be it, right? But for saying how difficult that is, and Napoleon was a person, now I don't know whether this quote is really attributable to him, but he definitely was a person who guided hundreds of thousands of men across Europe for 20 years. It's not really a person who had nothing, no experience in this field. So those were freaking complicated things. And always remember, strategical problems are incredibly difficult to solve. Tactical problems are relatively easy in comparison to strategical ones. And so, aside from this going on, von Clausewitz says, what is here required from the higher powers of the mind is a sense of unity, and a judgment raised to such a compass as to give the mind an extraordinary faculty of vision, which in its range allays and sets aside 1,000 dim notions which an ordinary understanding could only bring to light with great effort, and over which it would exhaust itself, which is literally what I was saying before about the problems of the 16 years old cadet in the Prussian military academy, right? There are different types of intelligence, but definitely there are certain exercises over which you have to apply an enormous amount of intellectual effort, right? Here it's exactly this fact that the average mind would exhaust itself even in trying to solve the problem. So don't think that you can sit here, for example, and listen to me talking about military history and pretending that we can both have this enormous understanding of the thing, unless we are some true experts of the military art, right? Because that takes a lifetime of work and studies. and still it's not everything, because theoretically you should be a military commander and a military historian to fulfill this, and this is at least what von Clausewitz tells us. So, and never underestimate the importance of military history in this regard. Theoretically, you can also become a great military commander just with military historical knowledge, but it's extremely rare. Extremely rare. I can't stress the adverb enough. But you shouldn't take it as a goal, I suspect, because it's particularly difficult. It's a bit like a coach, right? You know, usually all great coaches and trainers have been former practitioners of either sport or profession or whatever. So it's very rare to find someone who trains you for, I don't know, basketball, if you've never been a basketball player, just to make an example. But this is another story, we'll see it another time. And von Clausewitz comments, but this higher activity of the mind, this glance of genius, would still not become matter of history if the qualities of temperament and character of which we have treated did not give it their support. So never isolate intelligence in here from those other qualities of temperament and character which we have defined in the previous videos, that are essentially parts of your soul, not of your mind, that need to, however, to support each other. Okay. Von Clausewitz goes on and says, truth alone is but a weak motive of action with men, and hence there is always a great difference between knowing and action, between science and art. The man receives the strongest impulse to action through the feelings, and the most powerful succor, if we may use the expression, through those faculties of heart and mind which have considered under the terms of resolution, firmness, perseverance, and force of character. That are, you know, resolution, firmness, perseverance, and force of character are all explained in the previous videos. And as we were saying before, the concept is that here von Clausewitz actually makes consideration he has already done previously, that is, when he surrendered to, in fact, to the impossibility of having a science of war, and making the war just an art, the military science, let's say, just an art, not a science proper. And this happens because at the end of the day, and this is a very interesting statement, truth alone doesn't actually interest men so much. It's feelings that do. And this is important because it's the same reason for which science is discarded in order to understand war, and the art has to come into play. Because it's basically the reflection that our rationality is surrounded by a storm of passions that actually drive it. You know, we use reason not because we are intrinsically reasonable, but because we have developed it in order to satisfy our feelings. And it's our feelings that push us to do what we want. We apply reason like an instrument. So, and we do also, you know, we do make pretty irrational choices many times for this very reason. And in war, for this exact reason, you can't just have a perfect intellectual genius. You need a person who is resolute, is firm, is perseverant, and has a strong character. Because just intelligence cannot make it. We would be a kind of a godlike figures, like in a metaphysical space, if it was all about intelligence. And that wouldn't be even necessary, because war wouldn't exist at that point either. But even metaphysically speaking, because everything would be balanced, because we would be able to know basically everything that happens at a level that everything would be automatically settled, because we would be able to foretell how things would go anyway. In any case, in the real world, an only intelligent person is not good for command. we can't find solutions, right? But that could even and are used actually by the military, but they, it's the commander that has to take that and to apply it. Then von Clausewitz says, if, however, this elevated condition of heart and mind in general did not manifest itself in the general effects resulting from it, it could only be accepted on trust and faith, then it would be rarely become matter of history, right? So this is interesting because we study history on the basis of results, right? So we need to see how things turn out in order to judge. It's like with, just think about the exams. This week I've finished one pretty, I wouldn't say exhausting, but definitely boring tour de force to be judged for my research and what I'm doing and all this stuff. And it's very cool and very thought-provoking, I would say. I took this as a divertissement, essentially, to survive the boredom and the nuisance of the whole process that was kind of unnecessary, simply to observe the intellectual game that exists in the process, meaning that I know more or less what I'm doing, right? But other people don't. So it's a matter of interacting with them and showing them results on the base of, effectively what you've done. And if I hadn't provided that, they would have not known. They could have not been able to evaluate me. So that's why we need examinations. That's why we need judgments. We need people who judge on the base of experience and competence and ability, right? So it's kind of necessary in some ways. I mean, at least if you want a healthy society. But there are also obscure aspects of the story as well, meaning that, for example, miscomprehension is dramatic. I was making a video the other day exactly on the value of communication, in which I didn't really touch on this problems of miscommunications, but they're always important because at the end of the day, every person has a different judgment, right? It comes to different conclusions, and unfortunately, these are not entirely rational conclusions, and that's why we need a hierarchy, though, because we assume that the hierarchy is somehow more, it's built in order to make people to put in position of command people were less emotional than intelligent, or at least that have great intelligence that is able to overcome the emotions. And also, this is very difficult to assess, but whatever. I hope that at the end of the video, at least some part of the concept will be clear. Because communication is important, and I try to make an effort in spite of my evident English, my poor linguistical skills. But to be clear, I mean, to get to the point, to be effective by some measure. So, von Clausewitz goes on and writes, all that becomes known of the course of events in war is usually very simple, and has a great sameness in appearance. Now, this is really hell of a concept. What becomes known of the course of events in war is usually very simple, and has a great sameness in appearance. And this is not just an appearance, I would say. There is some truth into it. I mean, at least what we need to know about it and how things work are in part what basically the same Vom Kriege is all about. I mean, it's showing war for what it is, aside from the diversity of war. I mean, of the various contexts, right? But there is still dynamics that are kind of the same throughout all history, and they couldn't be otherwise. But at the same time, I think von Clausewitz here is meaning that we tend to narrow down the narrative of of such events, but not just of these ones, actually, to make it simpler, right? Clausewitz writes, no one on the mere relation of such events perceives the difficulties connected with them which had to be overcome. And this is so damn beautiful, and it is so damn true. I mean, how many times you've done something you've struggled for, and people have no idea of that, and you even feel bad in order to say you've gone through it because it sounds just like a complaint, right? And that's why miscomprehension is such a thing, because it doesn't take into consideration the real experience, and it is normal. And by the way, it's also necessary from a social point of view, because if we perfectly knew what each other did, we probably, paradoxically, this wouldn't have the effect of accelerating progress and work, but it would basically flatten everything down at the point we would extinguish ourselves. Instead, enmity, competition, and envy or something like that are actually healthy by a certain degree in our society, because they help building something in the process, right? And nevertheless, if we want to apply the lesson here to military history, the moral is never think you can tell history simply, right? There is this tendency that maybe, I don't know, I also am part of, because we all are at the end of the day, to simplify things, if anything for didactic reason. If I have to explain to you something, that my topics maybe to some of you seem rather niche, but that they are actually enormous topic from a historiographical point of view, and I don't even know them all from that hyper specialistic perspective. But it's obvious that we try to simplify. So the advice that works well for every single thing you hear in general about the world, about society, about policy, about war, etc., it's always not true, or at least that's not what reality is really about at the end of the day, and it's enormously more complicated. So you can't tell history just saying, oh well, this is black and this is white. It doesn't work like that. It can't, by definition. It's not like that. And instead, I think most of the approach in history is something like that. And the worst of it is that it's a priori. It's not deriving from judgment, because people with a certain understanding should be able to tell simple things in a relatively easy way. At least that's what we praise at the level of rhetorically, dialectically, logically, etc. Because we, unlike me, for example, it takes so much for explaining things. We like simple phrases. We like punchlines and effective statements. But at the same time, you should always be suspicious of very short things, of things that are, pretend to explain you the whole story like in 2 minutes, because we don't have time, right? It's better than nothing, I would say, if the problem is really educational, but just know that there is more. That awareness alone, not even knowledge about things you don't know, is important. It really saves a lot of of energies, and it is to be treasured. And Von Clausewitz goes on and says, it is only now and again in the memoirs of generals, or of those in their confidence, or by reason of some special historical inquiry directed to a particular circumstance, that a portion of the many threads composing the whole web is brought to light. So this is interesting, because it gets a bit deeper into the work of the historian, if you want. When you hear, this could be rephrased by getting not just deeper into the knowledge, but actually asking the people who have been in charge of those particular situations, and asking them how it really was. I mean, it's like asking Caesar what he thought of the Battle of Pharsalus, given we have made that example before. And we would probably observe in that sense that things were less easy than what we're usually prone to believe, because just we have one or a pair of reliable sources about the reasons and so on. Same goes for what concerns Charles XII before against in the Poltava campaign, or even about Henry IV in his visions about the role of France in 17th century Europe. But the concept is that when you get to know about these things, you regularly acknowledge that things are way more difficult than you and complicated than you believed. And perhaps I think we also need some reassurance at the end of the day. I mean, when you think about history, we were essentially trying. I think a great part of our mistakes is that we are essentially trying to make sense of it. Like, we pretend that history as a meaning in a kind of not necessarily teleological, but also in progressive perspective, right? And that there are many reasons for it. Part of the optical distortion is due to the fact that fortunately we have kind of improved our own life, but it's not always like that. And I think that there could be even a massive cultural crisis from the acknowledgement that it can't be always like that, because that's how we have built the modernity we live in. But aside from this, the point I wanted to make is that when we tell the story, we assume that people were in charge of the situation, that they were in control, right? They were able to direct. Most of the times, actually, everything happens very messily, and everybody can relate to this at an individual level. You can realize that even if you take your own life, some of the most important things that happen to you largely happened by chance. I mean, even if you were there to decide them to happen or not, still the conditions in which you were put in order to decide whether to make them happen or not were dependent on something else. And maybe we like to be to let, let's say, the destiny make its own course. We partly need it for sure, because we can't be obsessed about everything. We have to be a bit fatalist by necessity, otherwise we would have a pretty serious nervous breakdown. No. At best, I would say. Okay, where we're here. Okay, yes. So reading from these memoirs of generals and their statements or whatever, it can shed light on that. And always remember that in war, 3/4. This is what von Clausewitz put it. Like 3/4 of the grounds on which you should be able to make the decision are unknown. So you can imagine what does that mean. Basically, you're simply gambling, right? And that's, maybe the odds are more or less favorable, but it's always a great gamble. That can make you explain that this great decision how things happen are no. And even the deterministic approaches to history are bad, because you know, after the things happen, of course you can study them, so that people at the moment didn't quite know. So it's kind of easy to say, okay, well, I wasn't there on the field, but after, I don't know, some century, I can study what I know theoretically from that and say, okay, well, maybe the best decision would have been this. Well, most of the times we don't know it in the first place. Secondly, even the outcome is often told through a narrative as well, and this narrative is mostly hypothetic, like most of the times. I mean, how do you think things happen? Even in real life, you realize it's so difficult to reconstruct how things happen, really. and we have our own constant bias in the process. We're not purely rational, right? So von Clausewitz goes on and says the reflections, mental doubts, and conflicts which precede the execution of great acts are purposely concealed because they affect political interests, or the recollection of them is accidentally lost because they have been looked upon as mere scaffolding which had to be removed on the completion of the building. This is particularly important because you realize that we don't really... I mean, you can make many considerations about the hypocrisy of policy and ideologies and what you want to show off, I mean, the narratives in general. But you also have to understand why this happens all the time. I mean, when you are interested with a task, it's a pretty important one, and you freak out because you don't know how to handle that, and you give yourself time. I mean, you really don't want other people to know you have no clue how to solve the problem initially, would you? I mean, especially if you are in a position of responsibility, you're constantly put in front of challenges, and it's even normal to have that kind of initial disorientation, because otherwise you wouldn't be there to cope with things that are difficult. But at the same time, nobody needs to hear about your struggle. They only need you to solve the problem. So it's very, it's a very cynical consideration about society, but at the same time, it works. That's the incredible thing, that it's absurd. Of all the possibilities that could happen, that we exist as a society in the first place, and that things work, and that we're not killing each other on the street, on a regular base all the time. We are making a hell of a job to make this thing running, and the things that go well by far exceed the ones that go wrong at this point in history, at least. So and that comes from this assessment. This comes from this, if you want, cynical yet effective way of seeing the thing. There's a very economical thought behind it. It's the idea that wealth is not created magically out of nothing. It's created through pain and labor and difficulties. But if you solve the problem, you can do better next time with what you have gained and do more. That's essentially how society develops, right? And much of this is upon you. So complaining because there is someone else who kind of took you away what you presume it's necessary for you to go on. And most of the time it's just also a very selfish thing, that is to say, a very greedy way of seeing reality, and for which we are destroying in part what the good things that we have been building, because we presume that what we have is owed to us. We are extremely selfish. I mean, just for the fact of breathing, we need things. No. You need things, and then you go out there and take them and make them and earn them. That's how everything is started ever. That's how you can live in your world today, while 100 years ago your great-grandparents were struggling to survive in here. So shut the hell up and get a job. That's the point. But yeah, there are naturally other problems. This is also not, I don't want to be hypocritical myself. This is kind of a simple way also of interpreting the thing. There are other problems. There is injustice, there is malevolence, etc. But what I would like to stress is that everything starts from you. I mean, all the problems that you're criticizing about your own society are your problem. You are the one supposed to take care of them, to solve them at least, or not to complain otherwise. Because they really start from you. You are the only person who can make a difference. There is not some, abstract entity that's going to make things work all right. That's what children think, because they have their parents taking care of them. Then when you're an adult, you should be able to understand what that has meant. And unfortunately, we have so many people grow irresponsibilized at this point. Because we are not under pressure anymore. I mean, and I'm not making an ideological point. I believe that there are solid, sound structural reasons for this. It's not just about what you think, like, politically speaking. It's really deeper, unfortunately, and that makes it even more problematic and dangerous at many levels. Okay. And this naturally from Clausewitz, the serves from Clausewitz to even, but he will be more precise in the future. I mean, to observe how knowledge of all this dramatic state of being are usually lost because they're not important. Like, what counts is the victories, not generals' memoirs, right? And all these fears and troubles, you won, end of story. In conclusion to the third chapter, von Clausewitz writes, if now, in conclusion, without venturing upon a closer definition of the higher powers of the soul, we should admit a distinction in the intelligent faculties themselves according to the common ideas established by language, and ask ourselves what kind of mind comes closest to military genius, then a look at the subject as well as at experience will tell us that searching rather than inventive minds, comprehensive minds rather than such as have a special bent, cool rather than fiery heads, are those to which in time of war we should prefer to trust the welfare of our women and children, the honor and the safety of our fatherland. Now, this is a very powerful phrase. As you understand, von Clausewitz is a man of the 19th century. He has this context, but it's nevertheless, it never changes. Like, you can attribute different values to, but that's at the end of the story how war really affects the society we live in. But what is important in here is that von Clausewitz stresses what we need in order to get closest to military genius. That is, that you need searching minds rather than inventive minds. Comprehensive minds rather than such who have a special bent. Cool rather than fiery heads. So at the end of the day, you need a person who is able to look at something that really wants to find, not at something that randomly pops out and that seizes by chance. People who can therefore take all of this data, information, and say, okay, I can't dominate it. I can't put I can expand on all of them, and I don't have any particular bias. And a person who remains cool. A person who doesn't give up to emotions in order to calculate problems that have to be considered rationally. So these are the people you should take into consideration to put in a position of command, because those are the ones who can make better their job, and on which the fate of your country rests, right? All right. So, okay. Next chapter is chapter 4 of Danger in War, which is very interesting and lasts, however, very few. But I'm glad we're going on. We arrived now at almost, I think, 1/5 of the Vom Kriege. Alright, so I stop here. We have finished. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.